Welcome to Postcard English Stories, your friendly space to master English one story at a time. Whether you're here to improve your listening speaking or just enjoy engaging stories, you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join our journey to English fluency. Let's dive right in.
In the heart of a quiet, cobbled village, where the air smelled of fresh bread and the distant hum of a river whispered through the streets, there stood a small, cozy house with a single window facing the square. Every evening as the sun dipped below the rooftops, a soft, melodic sound would float through that window, the delicate, enchanting notes of a violin. That violin belonged to Thomas, a young boy with bright, curious eyes and a talent that seemed almost magical. Thomas was the son of a renowned violinist, a man whose name was whispered with admiration in concert halls across the region. For as long as he could remember, Thomas had grown up surrounded by music, his small hands guided by his father's, as he learned the subtle, graceful movements of the bow. But Thomas was not alone in his world of music. Just across the street, behind a weathered wooden gate and a small garden filled with wildflowers, lived Elias. Elias was nothing like Thomas. Where Thomas's world was polished and filled with the elegant hum of classical pieces, Elias's world was simple, filled with the cheerful songs of birds and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Yet it was music that brought them together. Elias had always been fascinated by the sound of Thomas's violin. Every evening he would sneak out to his garden, hiding behind the wildflowers, and listen. The gentle, soaring notes seemed to lift his heart, painting pictures of distant lands, of bright mornings and quiet, moonlit nights. And though he had no violin of his own, Elias would mimic the movements of a violinist, his hands dancing in the air, his heart filled with a quiet longing. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight cast a golden glow over the village, Thomas noticed a shadow among the flowers. Curious, he stopped playing, leaned out the window, and called out,
"Oh, is someone there?" Elias froze, his heart pounding. He had been caught. For a moment he thought of running, but then a kind, gentle voice called again. "You can come closer, you know. I won't bite." Slowly, Elias stood, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. But when he met Thomas's eyes, he saw only kindness. "Were you listening?" Thomas asked, smiling. I'm sorry," Elias stammered. "It's just, your music is so beautiful." To his surprise, Thomas smiled even wider. "Would you like to learn?" From that moment on, a friendship blossomed. Thomas taught Elias everything he knew about the violin. His father, though stern and strict, was moved by Elias's passion and allowed him to join their lessons. Though Elias had no violin of his own, Thomas's father gifted him an old, slightly worn violin, not as polished as Thomas's, but perfect in Elias's eyes. Every evening the two boys would play together beneath the great oak tree at the edge of the village, their music mingling with the rustling leaves and the distant murmur of the river. They spoke of dreams of one day performing together on the grandest stages of traveling the world, their violins singing in harmony. But as the years passed, life began to change. Thomas's talent blossomed, and his father, seeing a prodigy in his son, began to push him harder. Thomas was enrolled in the city's prestigious music academy, his days filled with rigorous lessons and endless practice. Elias, on the other hand, remained in the village, his life simple, his only escape the worn violin in his hands. The boys' evenings beneath the oak tree became rare, their laughter replaced by distant waves and unfinished conversations. Letters were exchanged, at first filled with excitement and dreams. But as Thomas's fame grew, the letters grew fewer and then stopped altogether. Elias tried to keep their promise alive. He played their favorite melodies beneath the oak tree, imagining Thomas beside him. But the empty air and the quiet rustle of leaves were his only audience. One rainy afternoon, a letter arrived for Elias. It was from Thomas, or rather from his father. Thomas had won a prestigious competition, a stepping stone to a brilliant career. There was no mention of Elias, only a brief, polite note of gratitude for his friendship. Hurt and betrayed. Elias stood beneath the oak tree, the rain soaking his hair, the worn violin in his hands. He played with all the emotion, the longing, the sorrow in his heart. The music rose and fell, a haunting melancholy melody that seemed to weep with him. And as the final note faded into the rain, Elias lowered the violin, his tears mixing with the raindrops. "You promised," he whispered to the empty air. "We promised." But there was no reply. Only the rain falling endlessly and the quiet empty silence beneath the great oak tree. Years passed and the village seemed to change with the seasons, but for Elias time felt frozen. He remained in the quiet village, his world defined by the familiar cobbled streets, the murmuring river, and the great oak tree where he once played alongside Thomas. But the melodies he played were different now, somber, melancholic, each note carrying a whisper of a friendship lost. The worn violin, a gift from Thomas's father, was his only companion. Its surface faded, the strings worn but lovingly maintained. It was not just an instrument to Elias. It was a memory. Meanwhile, Thomas's life took on a different tune. His talent blossomed, and his name began to appear in newspapers. Concert halls filled with eager audiences who came to hear the young prodigy, and his fame spread far beyond the village. He traveled from city to city, his performances met with thunderous applause. But for Thomas, each triumph felt a little emptier. The grand stages, the glittering lights, the thunderous applause. They were all a part of a dream he once shared with someone, but that someone was no longer beside him. He told himself that this was success, that this was what he had always wanted. Yet in the quiet of his dressing room, beneath the grand chandeliers and gilded mirrors, a sense of emptiness lingered. One winter's evening, as a soft snow fell upon the village, Elias stood beneath the great oak tree, his fingers gliding over the strings of his violin. His music drifted through the quiet streets, a haunting melody that seemed to dance with the snowflakes. But he played for no one, just the empty air and his own shadow. But that night, something changed. A traveler making his way through the village stopped beneath the tree, mesmerized by the melody. When Elias finished, the man approached him, his eyes filled with awe. "I have never heard such emotion, such sorrow in music," the man whispered. "Your talent is extraordinary." Elias smiled faintly. "It is just a memory." The traveler insisted, "This is not just talent. This is a gift. You must share it with the world." Elias shook his head. "The world has no place for forgotten melodies." But the traveler was persistent. He introduced himself as a music agent, someone who had heard many great musicians, but none like Elias. He offered to take Elias to the city to introduce him to those who could help him share his gift. At first, Elias hesitated. The city was Thomas's world, a world of fame and glittering lights. But as he looked at his worn violin, the quiet ache in his heart stirred. Perhaps this was his chance, not just to be heard, but to remember. Reluctantly, Elias agreed. The following week, he left the village carrying nothing but his violin and a small bag. As the carriage rolled away, he glanced back at the great oak tree, his heart heavy with memories. The city was a world of noise and light, a place where ambition burned brighter than the stars. Elias's music, raw and filled with emotion, drew the attention of those who heard it. He played in small halls at first, but soon his name began to spread. But even as his fame grew, his melodies remained the same, sad, haunting, and filled with longing. Those who listened were moved to tears, but none understood the sorrow that gave birth to those notes. And then, one evening in a grand, glittering concert hall,
Elias stood on stage, his violin beneath his chin, his bow poised. As the lights dimmed and the audience fell silent, his eyes caught sight of a familiar figure standing at the back of the hall. Thomas. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Elias's heart raced. Memories flooded back the oak tree, the promises, the laughter, and the betrayal. And then as his bow touched the strings, Elias's music changed. The melancholy grew sharper, the sorrow more piercing. The audience listened in silence, but for Elias, it was as though he was playing for one person, alone. When the performance ended, the applause was deafening, but Elias did not smile. He left the stage without a word, disappearing into the cold, misty night. But Thomas followed. He found Elias beneath a grand marble archway, his breath misting in the frigid air. Elias, I didn't know it was you. Not until I heard you play. Thomas stammered, his voice a mix of shock and regret. Elias turned, his eyes cold. Did you even remember me, or did fame wipe away everything we promised? I never forgot, Thomas whispered. But I thought you had moved on. Moved on. Elias's voice cracked, the weight of years pressing against his chest. I never moved on, Thomas. I never stopped playing, but I was always playing alone. There was a long silence, the snow falling gently around them. You had everything, fame, applause, a world of light. And I had nothing but shadows and memories. Elias whispered, his voice breaking. Thomas stepped forward, his eyes pleading. Then play with me, Elias. Let me make it right. Elias stared at him, his fingers tightening around the worn violin. But then he shook his head. Music is not something you can just fix. Not after you've forgotten the melody. And without another word, Elias turned and walked away, his figure swallowed by the mist, leaving Thomas alone beneath the cold, indifferent sky. Elias's words lingered in the cold night air, each one like a note struck in a minor key, hanging in the mist between them. As he walked away, his footsteps muffled by the snow, Thomas stood frozen. Guilt pressing on his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. For days, Thomas tried to focus on his concerts, his fame, his adoring audience. But no amount of applause could silence the emptiness gnawing at his heart. He thought of Elias's face, the sorrow in his voice, the haunting melodies that had filled the concert hall. The music had been more than just sound. It had been a cry, a memory of something precious and lost. Unable to escape the ache inside him, Thomas made a decision. He canceled his remaining concerts and disappeared from the glamorous world of music. His manager was furious, the press speculated wildly, but Thomas didn't care. He had one goal: to find Elias. He returned to the village where they had grown up, where their laughter had once filled the air beneath the great oak tree. But Elias was not there. The village had changed, but the memories remained. The oak tree stood strong, its branches bare in the winter chill, and beneath it, a single mark carved into the bark, T+E. Thomas traced the letters with his fingers, memories flooding back, two boys promising to conquer the world together, sharing melodies beneath the whispering leaves. Desperate, Thomas wandered the nearby streets, asking about Elias, searching for any trace of his lost friend. Finally, an old woman in the village square remembered. The boy with the violin, I saw him heading to the city. He's become quite the musician, you know. But his music, it's so sad. With a new sense of purpose, Thomas returned to the city, but Elias was not easy to find. The city was a maze of crowded streets, glittering lights, and endless faces. He searched concert halls, music clubs, and even the quiet alleys where street musicians played. But Elias seemed to be a ghost, his music a whisper just beyond reach.
But one evening, as Thomas wandered the winding streets, a familiar melody drifted through the misty air, soft, melancholic, and filled with longing. His heart raced, and he followed the sound weaving through the narrow alleys until he reached a small, dimly lit tavern. There, on a small shadowed stage, stood Elias, his head bowed over the worn violin, his fingers gliding across the strings. His music filled the room, a river of sorrow that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Thomas stood at the back, silent, his heart aching with every note. He waited until the performance ended, until the quiet applause died away, and the tavern emptied. As Elias packed his violin, Thomas stepped forward. Elias. Elias froze, then slowly looked up. His face was older, tired, but his eyes still carried that same quiet sadness. You again. Elias whispered, his voice a mix of disbelief and bitterness. Please, let me speak. Thomas pleaded. I was a fool. I let fame take me away, I let promises slip away, but I never forgot you. Not truly. Did you remember me on those grand stages, when you played to thousands? Or only now, when you've lost yourself? Elias's voice was sharp, but his hands trembled. I remember the oak tree, Thomas whispered. I remember our melodies, our dreams. But my music, it became empty without you. Please, Elias, give me one more chance. Elias stared at him, his expression torn. Part of him wanted to turn away to leave Thomas in the darkness. But another part, the boy beneath the oak tree, the boy who had dreamed of standing beside his friend on a grand stage, could not let go. One chance, Elias whispered, his voice trembling. But I promise nothing. Thomas nodded, his heart pounding. That's all I ask. And beneath the misty glow of the streetlights, two friends stood in silence. Their shadows stretched long against the cobblestones, the distant hum of a forgotten melody whispering between them. The Forgotten Violin. A melancholy melody of a lost friendship. Part 4. The days that followed were a delicate dance between hope and hesitation. Thomas and Elias began meeting beneath the great oak tree, once more the place where their friendship had first blossomed. But the air between them was different now, filled with the weight of lost time, of unspoken regrets, and of unhealed wounds. Thomas brought his violin, its polished surface gleaming under the dappled sunlight. Elias brought his old, worn violin. The wood faded, but the sound rich and haunting. When they played, their melodies intertwined, but there was a tension in the notes, a struggle, a conversation of sadness and longing. You've lost your heart, Thomas. Elias whispered one evening as the sun dipped below the hills. Your music is flawless, but it's empty. Thomas looked at him, shame in his eyes. And yours, Elias. It's beautiful, but it's full of pain. Elias turned away, because it remembers everything we lost. But even in the tension, something began to change. Each day as they played together, their melodies grew softer, more harmonious. Old memories resurfaced, they laughed again, sharing stories beneath the oak tree, the wind whispering through the leaves. One evening, as twilight painted the sky with hues of orange and pink, Thomas looked at Elias. There's a concert in the city, a grand stage. I want you to play with me. Elias's heart raced. A concert. Yes. Our melody, our story. Not just mine, not just yours, but ours. Elias hesitated, memories of the empty stages, of Thomas's fame, of the betrayal swirling in his mind. But as he looked into Thomas's eyes, he saw something different, a quiet sincerity, a longing to make things right. One last time, Elias whispered, his voice trembling. But only if it's our music. Thomas smiled, his heart pounding. Our music. The weeks that followed were filled with preparation. They wrote a piece together, a sonata for two violins. It began with a gentle, nostalgic melody, echoing the innocence of their childhood beneath the oak tree. But as the piece unfolded, it became a storm, a clash of harmonies, a battle of sorrow and regret, before finally resolving into a gentle, hopeful harmony. The night of the concert arrived. The grand hall was filled with a hushed audience, the air thick with anticipation. Thomas stood beside Elias, his heart racing but his gaze steady. "Ready," he whispered. Elias nodded, his fingers brushing against the worn strings of his violin. "Ready." The curtain rose, and the lights bathed them in a soft glow. For a moment they stood in silence, the world beyond the stage fading away. Then Thomas raised his bow, and Elias followed. The first notes were soft, delicate like a whisper shared beneath an old oak tree. But as their music grew, it carried the weight of years of joy and sorrow, of a friendship lost and found again. The audience sat in silence, mesmerized by the raw emotion that filled the air. As the final notes faded, the hall erupted into thunderous applause. But for Thomas and Elias, the world seemed quiet. They looked at each other, tears in their eyes, and smiled. "We did it," Thomas whispered. "We did," Elias replied, his voice thick with emotion. But just as they stepped backstage, a journalist approached. "Thomas, that was incredible. But tell me, how does it feel to perform with a street musician?" Elias's smile faded, his heart sinking. Thomas's face paled. "He is not just a street musician," Thomas said firmly, his voice strong. "He is my friend, and tonight we played our story." But Elias's expression had changed. Memories of the past, of feeling abandoned, of being forgotten, rushed back. Without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the misty streets outside. Thomas called after him, his voice desperate. "Elias, please." But the night swallowed Elias's figure, leaving Thomas alone once more beneath the indifferent glow of the city lights. The misty streets seemed endless as Elias walked away, his mind a storm of emotion. Memories of laughter beneath the great oak tree, of whispered promises of melodies shared, all of them clashed with the bitter reality of his lost friendship. The applause still echoed in his ears, but to him it felt empty, a hollow sound that could never fill the void in his heart. Thomas stood in the empty concert hall, the applause fading, the stage dark and silent. He had tried to make things right, to share their music, to reclaim their bond. But the words of the journalist had shattered the fragile connection they had rebuilt. Days turned into weeks, and silence settled between them once again. Elias returned to the quiet corners of the city, playing his violin in shadowed alleys and forgotten squares. His music was raw, aching with a sorrow that only deepened. The old violin in his hands was his only companion, its worn strings carrying the weight of his grief. Thomas, too, was lost. His fame meant nothing to him now. Each performance felt like a charade, his flawless technique empty, without the soul of their shared melody. He tried to write, to compose, but his notes felt cold, lifeless. But one cold winter's night, beneath a pale moon, a familiar melody drifted through the mist. Thomas was walking aimlessly, his heart heavy, when he heard it, a soft, sorrowful tune drifting on the night air. His heart raced, and he followed the sound, his breath misting in the cold. And there, beneath the great oak tree, stood Elias. His eyes were closed, his fingers dancing across the strings, his music a river of longing and regret. Thomas stepped forward, tears in his eyes. "Elias, please." Elias stopped playing, but he did not look up. "You promised me once that we would share the stage. You promised we would share our music. But you chose fame. You forgot me." "I didn't forget you," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. I lost myself. I thought fame was everything, but I was wrong. Please, don't turn away. Silence stretched between them, the cold wind rustling the bare branches of the oak tree. Elias's voice was soft, trembling. Our music. It was never about fame. It was about us, our friendship, our dreams. Thomas stepped closer, his violin in his hands. Then let's play. Here now. Not for anyone else. Just for us. Elias hesitated, but then he raised his violin, and beneath the moonlight they began to play. The melody was soft, at first hesitant, but it grew rising and falling, a conversation between two souls that had been lost, but were now found again. Tears streamed down their faces as they played, each note a word, each harmony a memory. And as the final notes faded, Elias lowered his violin, his voice a whisper. I forgive you, Thomas. Thomas sobbed, his heart breaking and healing at the same time. Thank you. They stood in the quiet of the night side by side beneath the oak tree, their violins resting in their hands. For the first time in years they felt whole. Their story became a legend in the village, the tale of two friends who found each other again through a forgotten melody. And though their lives would take them in different directions, they never forgot the music they had shared. For in the notes of their melody, in the quiet glow of the moonlight beneath the oak tree, they had found something far greater than fame or applause. They had found each other.